Um, Welcome to you all to this new virtual world. My name is Bjorn Hilsetter. I'm head of the Joint Data Center on Force Displacement. And what you have joined is the third event in our seminar series. And I'm delighted to say a few words by way of introduction. The knowledge dissemination is a core part, one of the 5 priorities of the Joint Data Center. And this is one of our products. And I wanted to just mention a few of the others up front, a little bit of a promotion and stunt. First of all, we have a literature review of recent academic writings on quantitatively driven research on forced displacement. I think we currently have more than 400 academic articles and other high quality studies in our database. All of the articles that we have in that database are neatly summarized in half a page or a page to make them as accessible as possible to both other researchers, but also to policymakers as well as to practitioners. So we do an update of this literature review once a month, and it's sent out with our newsletter. So please go and I think you will find a link in this invitation to where you can sign up for the newsletter. We will also launch a new product tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly when, which we call a quarterly digest. A digest that will focus on one particular topic that we feel is not getting sufficient attention, or that we find is particularly topical. The first one will be about long-term impact of hosting large groups of forcibly displaced, and we have drawn on economic historians to pull out a number of interesting conclusions. The third piece, which is very topical, is that we have done a primer on ongoing or just initiated research on socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19, basically doing inventory of work that has just been initiated as a way to connect researchers and practitioners and make sure that work is from different parts of the world builds on each other and complement each other rather than overlaps. Again, an important part of our knowledge dissemination is the seminar series. The first one was with Guy Grossman, who is with Penn and Stanford, who has created a data set of de jure asylum and refugee policies of over 90 countries across the developing world. I think we held that in November, December last year. In February, just before the lockdowns, we had Martin Orvalian from Georgetown University join us, talking about labor market interventions for refugee integration, where he promotes a market for work permits. This time, we will learn about some fascinating work based in, I think, primarily Iraq, on perception surveys among displaced populations, and where you will hear a number of lessons learned and innovations from some pretty in-depth work in the Mashrek. The two presenters, Phuong, Pham and Patrick Vinck, are both with Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Both have very distinguished academic careers, but importantly, they also have extensive field level experience of humanitarian work. I was in Boston visiting then just in February, and I found the approach that you have at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative fascinating. It's interdisciplinary, and you cut across faculties at Harvard and other academic institutions up in and around Boston. And as a generalist and international relations person, I very much personally sympathize with the approach that you take. The mission of the initiative is to build the evidence base of humanitarian studies and professionalizing the field of humanitarian aid with an emphasis on innovation, effectiveness, and leadership, and that you couldn't be better aligned with the ambitions of the Joint Data Center. So I'm personally exceptionally pleased to welcome both of you to this series. And for just for full disclosure, Phuong and Patrick are also behind the founders of Kobo Toolbox, which is a suite of software for digital data collection and visualization, extensively used by the parent institutions of the JDC, both UNHCR and the World Bank. And we are a close partner of the Kobo Toolbox. Before I turn over to Phuong and Patrick, let me just introduce Arthur. Arthur Lagrange is a senior economist at the Joint Data Center, and he will be the moderator today. And I also want to recognize Domenico Tabasso, who is another senior economist with the JDC, who has made this happen. But he has also made a new baby come to life over the weekend, and hence he's not able to join us 100% today. I also want to express my appreciation to other colleagues at the JDC who have organized the logistics and lent their IT support to the seminar. Without further ado, let me hand over to Arthur, perhaps. Do you want to kick it off? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. Thank you so much for this introduction, and a couple of housekeeping matters. I see that we are a full house. By the way, very nice to see friends, colleagues across UNHCR, World Bank, other organizations, academia connected. It's thrilling to see such an audience joining. But because we're so numerous, it's important that you mute yourself while you are not talking. And also, if you could turn off your camera so we save some bandwidth, this will help to have a smooth webinar. In terms of questions, if you have questions during the presentation, please write them down in the chat, and presenters will either take question on the fly where they relate to immediate clarification and need for explanation as they present, or address the question at the end of the presentation. Note that the seminar will be recorded, so you will have access to a video of this webinar, as well as receive presentation slides. They will be also saved and available. I think we went through all the logistic points, and so I would like to leave the floor to the presenters. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Arthur, Bjorn, for this generous introduction. We are, of course, very excited and happy to be here and join you from Boston. Phuong and I are married, so we are together, not distancing at the moment. And I see that she is now sharing the screen, which should be a significant step up from the video of my uncut hair after 3 months of isolation. But we were very, looking forward to this discussion today. What we decided today was to look back a little bit at almost 15 years of research and evolution of our work in the field, and share kind of some lessons learned, and where we see our work going in the near future, and look forward, of course, to hear your thoughts and comments on this. So I will actually jump in, if that's okay. Phuong is going to present in the latter half of the the presentation, I'll just note that I'm lucky to be the Director of Research of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Phuong heads our program on evaluation there. And as Bjorn mentioned, a lot of our work is really focused on making sure that we provide actionable, valuable, useful information for decision-making and program development. And what we like the most is we work a lot on monitoring evaluation, but we work very much a lot on the formative stage, that is trying to understand the context in which operations are being developed, and how do we then structure them for success by better understanding and engaging with local population. Now, some of the items and some of the aspects I'll present are probably familiar for people with your level of experience, but we wanted to just start by posing a little bit the diagnostic. And when we started, a common issue with the data landscape is that you have a lot of studies that exist. There are lots of information out there, but there are so many gaps. And so you will, for example, have a study that is being conducted among IDPs in selected camps of a specific regions, but you don't know what's going on elsewhere. You don't know what's going on for those who are displaced in the community. And so it becomes very complicated to kind of have a broad picture of what is happening on the ground. And part of what we were trying to do was to engage into fairly large-scale field data collection to address those existing gaps. And another gap is that you have a lot of studies again, but when you like, okay, what happened after? What was the next one? What happened? So we have these snapshots at specific moments in time on the data, but we don't necessarily know what was happening before or how has the situation changed over time. Very often when we look at evaluation, we are asked after the fact, but we don't have a baseline. We don't know what the situation was before. And so understanding what the trajectory on key indicators is was a big part of what we've been trying to develop and do over time. And so we moved from fairly long interval studies being done at a couple of years intervals. For example, in northern Uganda, during the height of the conflict with the Lord's Resistance Army, we did a series of surveys, but with almost 2 years interval. They were valuable to give a broad sense of change, but we've now moved in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo or the Central African Republic to conducting quarterly polls that really get the pulse and try to understand how is the situation changing and how quickly are some key measures changing. Finally, and you're probably very familiar with that as well, which is that by the time you're able to actually implement a study after you decided it would be useful, very often it's too late when you get the results. So there was really a need for faster processing, and this is something that we learned very early on. Phuong and I were involved in 2003 in Iraq, just after the fall of Baghdad. We, in one of our first collaboration, in fact, we were asked to do an assessment of perception around the reconstruction process, priorities, and so on. And while we were able to share our preliminary findings, the full report was not available until roughly a year and a half later. So things like perception of the de-Baathification process, the lustrating process that took place, and how it was perceived, for example, information like that was too late to actually be useful. And that's very much what led us to our focus on both technology, but also processes to make sure that we're able to produce and collect high quality data in a rapid manner. So what have we done in response to those gaps, and what, was it about getting everything on everybody? Well, almost. What we've done by now is over 50 surveys in 15 countries, more than 200,000 interviews. But really the focus was to make sure that, one, we were producing quality data, and when possible, creating those longitudinal data set that allow to look at the evolution over time. We wanted to make sure that we employ rigorous methodology in complex settings. Now, very often people will talk about a trade-off and how reality in the field means that you cannot conduct high quality research. we actually feel differently, and we've been able to implement what we see as high quality research, but it does require some practice, learning lessons, using technology in an appropriate way. But it's also a space for innovation. Questions like, how do you sample in a fast-moving population? How do you conduct in-depth interviews with people who speak different languages? Those are simple questions, but we had to figure it all out. And as a side note on the digital data collection, when we started, there was nothing off the shelf. Well, sorry about that. Among our first assessment, we found ourselves with thousands and thousands of paper-based questionnaire that we had almost to use crate for shipping back for data entry. I mean, it was logistically challenging, and so our drive over the last 15 years has really been on trying to innovate and make that process easier for the field. And central really is this idea of creating evidence-based policy space. That is, using information, to inform policies and to inform programming. How do we create the appropriate participatory approach? How do we engage? How do we create recommendations, but that are not from what ultimately we are, that is outsider? We come in we speak from a very clear perspective of a Western-based academic institution. So how do we make sure that we create a local partnership and grounding that is necessary for relevant studies? Sorry, there was a bit of noise there. So what we'll do today is again talk a little bit about that process and how we approach this idea of creating data.
Ja, daar steht zo'n hoofd ons aan.
Somebody needs to mute themselves. So how we create data, how we create space for policy discussion informed by data and evidence, and then what are some of the next steps, some of the new directions that we see happening in the field. So as far as creating data, again, few buzzwords, but they are really the core value of what we do, which is to make sure we create relevant data that is reliable, that is available in a timely manner, and that is representative, which can be a challenge, as we'll be discussing later. How do we make sure we document trends and not just those cross-sectional data that can change quickly? And how do we create a space that is very participatory in the process? So that's what will, sorry, I'm just going back, but that's what will frame the discussion today. So I'm now in the creating data, and then we'll discussing the space for policy and the next steps. So, the foundation of our work was very much 15 years ago. Phuong and I conducted a series of studies I mentioned in northern Uganda, but also in the Philippines, partly looking at the process of decision-making among people who were forcibly displaced around settlements, whether people decide to stay in place, whether people decide to resettle somewhere else, whether people decide to return home. What's the threshold? When do people make those decisions? And really trying to understand that process. What we found in a very simple way, again, people with your expertise will know that, but that is that people in the end are very irrational beings. So when we look at the factors that people weight, pretty much is around access to services. And on one hand, with typically access to services being better in either place of displacement or places of resettlement, versus access to livelihood opportunities and the value and land attachment to lands. And so you've got kind of those two factors. How do we perceive access to services, and how do we perceive access to livelihood? And people make a very rational weighting of these variables. Now, there are, of course, other factors coming in, but if we simplify it down, those were the two main factors that we found in the studies in Uganda as playing, and Philippines as playing an important a role. And it's interesting because you can then transfer that finding into a very concrete policy discussion that was happening in northern Uganda, which was, do you want people to return home, in which case you really have to focus on developing services at the point of return, or do you want actually people to resettle and stay in camps that would then transform themselves into more urbanized area, in which case you need to focus on the livelihood opportunities. And so you have fundamentally a question of policy decision, which is around decentralizing services or creating livelihood opportunities. But in the end, that's very much a issue of development and peace building. And so, you know, it's interesting that 15 years later, and now this is framed as the nexus, the triple nexus, but very much this is what we saw as a central issue to questions around displacement, forced displacement, and individual decision-making around where to live. Now that framework has evolved over time, and as I mentioned, we've done many studies now. And I don't know why, here it is. So I'm having small technical issues to move things out of the way. And so we've now come to conceptualize most of our perception studies around 6 dimensions. And understanding perception and decision-making as it being influenced by information and communication, how much people are informed, what access to media they have, around resources, of course, economic. I mean, if you cannot afford to move, then obviously that's going to be a factor, but also legacy of the past. What is the effect of the conflict, both from a purely practical, physical, physiological, mental health, for example, perspective, but also the legacy of the conflict in terms of how you perceive others, aspects of reconciliation to come into this dimension. And that goes also across, and of course, these dimensions are not purely or very clear cut sometimes, but it goes into the question of social cohesion. Do you trust people? Who do you trust? Why? Do you trust institution? How do you define your identity? Then factors touching more on leadership, governance, politics. Are you able to, do you feel involved in decision making? Are you able to participate in public life? Do you feel that your representative serve in your best interest? And all these factors are important because the level of trust that they generate, for example, directly inform how people behave. And finally, aspects of justice and security. We talked, I mentioned earlier aspects of reconciliation, but they are very much interlinked with how safe people feel, but also whether they feel that accountability has been achieved for past violence, whether those responsible were identified, whether they feel they've been acknowledged as victims, for example. So as you can see, those 6 dimensions are very broad, but for us, they've been really framing in the last few years or studies, and they are fixed. That is, they are pretty well defined, but country by country, we achieve very different questions and questionnaires because the domains of measurements, the specific articulation, if you like, of these dimensions varies importantly from countries to country. The best way I always say it is that how you measure social cohesion in Rwanda should be very different from how you measure social cohesion in neighboring DRC, or obviously should be very different from how you measure social cohesion in places like Timor-Leste. But we need to understand and conduct deep work to understand how to best articulate those questions and how to discuss those dimensions. And so very much that's part of what we do as our research cycle, which is represented here. I'm not going to go through the research cycle, but I'll just emphasize the importance of what's on the top here, the consultation. Identifying those gaps, but also consulting and understanding in depth how concepts that are kind of fairly abstract can actually be understood and operationalized in a given country. And while when we talk about data collection and see we teach about methods, people imagine we talk about how to collect data. In fact, the biggest part is about how to conceptualize your data collection. I sometimes joke that in the process of creating a data collection platform, we've made it very easy to collect data, but at the same time, we made it easy to collect bad data. And so we really emphasize this need for participation and in-depth work in the conceptualization of research. And for that, we've developed a number of tools. I mean, I think they're going to be fairly simple. But one example here is some slightly different work on education and peace. But the idea is the same, which is to move a little bit away from standard log frames, theories of change, and take all these concepts and do brainstorming. Okay, what does it mean? How do you conceptualize? How do you think about this in a given country? And kind of do almost automated writing, like ask people write down post-its and put them down, and then figuring out how different contexts relate, so we can start better defining what the content of a study should be. And in that process, we also use something that people in the space of technology might be familiar with, that's typically used to define or design user experience. But we do it from a survey perspective by trying to get what are the people of interest? Who are the people that you want to interview? Let's define them. Let's make them as real as possible. And in that process, then let's ask ourselves, what can we ask them? What kind of questions would I want to ask if I had that person in front of me? And so we do this exercise with communities. We do this exercise with program managers. But the idea is to help create a very participatory approach to the conception of an instrument. Now, for people in the humanitarian space, you may say, well, we don't have the time to do this. We don't. Well, the reality is most humanitarian situations are protracted situations. There are places of deep and long-term engagement. So it's very much possible at some point in the cycle to do this type of work. There's room for quick and dirty, but there's also room for really participatory exercise to take a step back and think through how we are measuring things. Now, don't get me wrong, it's very important to have standardized tools, to have standardized questions, but it's also very important to be very local and contextualized in the research. And so we try to balance those two aspects in our research. This is, again, brainstorming. Once you've defined those concepts, once you've defined the personas, then you get community members. It could be done at the village level. It could be done with program officers. You ask them, well, write down questions, just write down questions. And so then you start, and you do it in multiple waves, and you start to see themes coming together. You then start to see similar questions. And then our work is to take those questions and kind of improve on them or ground them in the slightly more scientific way of asking questions. But in the end, they are their questions. And so this process very much helps build local instruments. So the key factors is the need for constant adaptation. I didn't talk much about sampling. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but constant adaptation of the content and making sure that localization is not just a, asking community is not localization. Getting community to work with you on what to ask is very much what we focus on. So what overall strategy for data collections are out there? And I tried here to take kind of 5 broad components that you probably seen. Crowdsourcing is about kind of volunteered information. Crowdseeding was an interesting option for us, which is instead of just volunteered information, you actually select individuals, you equip them, and you consult them on a regular basis. Crowdseeding neighborhood methods is the same idea, except that now those are individuals in the communities that you identified. You also ask them to conduct interviews with others or to collect data from others. And so you increase in some ways the number of people being the same number of seats. And then there are phone-based interviews that are an option in some context. But our main tool has been to continue with face-to-face interviews. And the main rationale for that is that in most places where we work, remote connectivity is an issue. So the phone-based connection wasn't necessarily a possibility. There are issues of security that we felt were, or not just felt, but in consultation that were clearly identified when we talked about community-based methods, whether crowdseeding or crowdsourcing. So what we've done instead in most contexts is partner with a number of local universities to decentralize as much as possible, but still be grounded in university and still conduct face-to-face interviews. We've done a number of programs where we've done phone-based interviews, and we are obviously in this time of COVID, we're doing many more of that. But they are really not an alternative in the sense that with phone-based interviews, you're limited to probably about 15 to 20 minutes interviews. The response rate is significantly lower, but at the same time, they do provide data when access on the ground is not possible. And it does provide a faster turnaround for deployment because you avoid a lot of the logistics. So we see these very much not as opposed methods, but rather as complementary methods that very much depend on the context and the type of data and the depth of information that you are trying to collect. A lot of our studies take place over roughly 1 hour, 1 hour and a half interviews. They are very in-depth, combined qualitative and quantitative data. So we've typically privileged face-to-face interviews. But as I noted, and Phuong will present later in this presentation, we're increasingly focused on technologies as well. Now, I mentioned mixed methods, and you know it's not uncommon to see mixed methods now. It was more rare a few years ago, but very much we advocate for this. And typically the design that we use is what we call the sequential mixed methods, where we conduct a wave of qualitative data collection first that helps us understand the depth and complexity of issues. And then based on that understanding, we design a quantitative instrument for data collection, and then based on we use the results to conduct an additional wave of qualitative data collection that helps us interpret and contextualize those results. A simple example of that latter part of the contextualization is we conducted surveys in Eastern DRC, and we're very surprised to find high rates of reported forms of gender-based violence among men. And the qualitative work really showed us that a lot of men were defining the fact that their spouse had been abused or that they were forced to witness abuses as their own violations. And so it led us to really rethink and reframe some of the questions, but that helps us contextualize and interpret the results of the data we collect. So I'll skip on this and just, you know, again, it's not a pitch, but I think it really helps to understand why we created Kobo Toolbox. Kobo Toolbox is a data collection platform. If you're not familiar with it, you can think of it as a Survey Monkey or other online forms, but that are very much made to be simple and easy to use in complex environment, including offline, support for multiple language, support for navigation in the form. But the reason it was created is because we needed it. We did not have something like that in Iraq in 2003. We did not have something like that in our next study. And so we found ourselves taking a lot of time encoding data. And so the primary driver for Kobo was to shorten that cycle, was to make sure that the day we finished data collection, we're able to actually analyze and produce some results. But in the process, what we found is that we were able to improve the quality of the data being collected. I mean, simple things like, you know, how old are you? I'm so happy not to see anyone 199 years old or more in our data, but those are common mistakes. Or, you know, men being asked if they are pregnant because the skipping pattern was not respected. So all these quality improvements made a big difference in our work and in the ability to produce information quickly. And then more exciting, once we moved towards the digital aspect, we were able to combine multiple sensors and collect different streams of data within the same form, within the same tool. So obviously, voice, image capture, videos. I mean, you can capture everything within a single form, which has greatly expanded the complexity and the depth we can go into with the form that we have, including geographic elements, for example. But this is not about Kobo, but I think it was important just to show that they move together side by side. Or work on technology is very much informed by what we see as needed in the field to improve data collection, and increasingly, of course, what others see in a very participatory approach to the development. So some examples of this. We shared the Iraq report, and I'll get to that in a minute. I think, I just wanted to show some illustration. In CAR, it was interesting for us to see that in these camps, people actually moved through multiple sites, including the community, before reaching the camp. Some of the other findings, I just put a few sentences here, but is that, for example, in the decision to return here, people gave a lot of role to the opinion of other people and the authorities at the displaced sites. The security, the perception of the security, as we've noted, is also a major obstacle to return. These are just some of the example of insights that we can get from doing these rapid surveys with communities in situation of displacement. The Iraq report for us was interesting because it was one of the first time where we did in parallel assessment both in camps and in the community. And so the methodology is outlined in the report, but the idea was to follow fairly rigorous sampling procedures to be able to look at the experience and perspective of respondents across the scope, across the type of displacement, if you like. And what we found here is kind of the 5 big highlights. One is the prioritization, of course, for security, livelihood, but also the importance for accountability and truth. We saw that respondents believe that everyone should be held accountable. So there was really a strong demand for broad accountability, not just for those most responsible, but really for a large acknowledgement and recognition of those who contributed, enabled, or simply stood by while atrocities were committed. And not only that, but they also wanted harsh punishment. Interestingly, while there's little trust in the justice system, most respondents wanted to see that process as being very local. So some of you may be familiar with the International Criminal Court investigations that are happening, but in both Central African Republic and in Iraq, what we found is that people really want processes that are local, that are visible and accessible to them. They identified a need for reconciliation in Iraq, but noted that accountability and justice efforts was essential for trust and reconciliation. And overall, there was a low optimism for peace. But if we bring this to the analysis that is not presented here, but that we've looked at in terms of return barriers and the return decisions, typically we're focused on what I presented at the very beginning of this presentation, which is the livelihood aspects, the security aspects, the access to services aspects. But in Iraq, especially among the minority Yazidi, the perception of accountability is also extremely important in the return decision. And what we found is a lot of them were not returning, partly out of insecurity and perception of what was on the ground, but also and largely out of mistrust and perceived impunity and lack of accountability for what had happened. Now, again, it goes back to these questions and the framework I presented earlier, which is we cannot dissociate those very practical humanitarian questions around return, settlement, from broader development, peace-building questions around accountability, for example, in this case. And very much our work is trying to make those links and understand more broadly what can be done to these communities and provide measures that respond to their needs and expectations. I've taken quite a bit of time now looking at all this, so I'll skip on 1 or 2 slides. But I wanted to emphasize, that obviously the data itself, it's not that simple. It's not just that the data is going to provide the responses. But what's valuable about it is what is discussed next, which is creating that space for policy, for discussions. It's extremely valuable when you go back to the community and are able to engage individuals by saying, well, these are the perception of people next door. These are the perception of other communities. What do you think about that? What do you think can be done about it? And the reality, we do that at a fairly high level as well. So you know, it's difficult. I understand that many organizations want very practical operational recommendations, but many times what we feel is more valuable is to create a space for discussion and brainstorming and really advocate around data. And in places like Eastern DRC, we've literally created the role of data advocates. That is, we have teams on the ground whose role is primarily to go to meeting and say, this is what data says. So you're debating, but let's not just talk about opinions. Here is what data we have. So what do you think can be done? What do you think this data means? So the two graphs, I thought, you know, having some cartoons is always useful. So what we try to avoid is this. We try to make the information clear, concise, and useful, but at the same time, we have to embrace some complexity. The reality is that the topics that we are discussing are not clear-cut, and so our role is really around trying to present that information in a way that is comprehensible, useful, but also leaves room for interpretation and discussion around what it means. And finally, what we also try to avoid is the next cartoon, which is that you know, we didn't accomplish anything, but that's what meetings are for. No, we actually try to make sure again that we leave these meetings with information that can shape decisions that are being made. The third aspect we wanted to discuss today, and I'll hand over to Phuong in a couple of minutes, but we discussed kind of this process of creation of data, discussed some of the examples of findings we have from the field. We discussed very briefly this engagement and creating of policy space. But then now we need to look forward and look at other issues and next steps in the field. I think that discussing ethical issues, you know, how we focus on quality would take in itself an entire presentation. But let's just note for now that there are increasingly emerging issues around the protection of data. Obviously, EU has the GDPR, but the data governance in many countries is changing quite quickly. And we need to be more adaptable in how we respect those rules and how we ensure the protection of the people whose data we are actually collecting. There are interesting issues that are emerging. Group privacy is one that, you know, when you think about consent, when you think about data protection, you very much typically focus on the individual, but there are also really questions around groups and how groups are handled. For example, what level of aggregation you provide and what risks that entails. A clear example is when you take, you know, it's maybe a bit of a stretch here, but it's very telling that if somebody consents to give you their DNA, you now have information about all their family or their relatives who share at least some part of the DNA, yet those relatives never consented. The same with Facebook, ghost profile. Ghost profile is when you are not on Facebook, so you did not consent to anything, but other people are talking about you. So now Facebook has information about you while in fact you did not consent to anything. So we need to really fundamentally rethink how individualized ethical concerns need to be broadened and how we can practically do that in the field. It's part of our research. Again, I'm not going to delve into that too much now because of time, but it's very fundamental to the work we are doing. Phuong will talk a little bit more about some of the call center and distance dynamics, but as I mentioned at the beginning, we've tested a number of phone-based surveys, and they are very valuable as a complementary aspects for face-to-face interview, and primarily focused on where access is problematic on our side. Just to finish with the cartoon, because I know Phuong doesn't have any cartoons in her slides, but we also look at new streams of data. We've collected data from WhatsApp groups, from Twitter, from Facebook, and again, it's changing very quickly. And I like this cartoon because in '93 the cartoon was saying, on the internet nobody knows you're a dog, and then the 2015 version says, remember when on the internet nobody knew who you were. Because things have changed so quickly as to how inferences, how data is being collected, and how sensors are operating all around us. this creates valuable opportunities, but we have to approach these very carefully. And when we are in a mix of practitioners, we are sometimes concerned by how quickly pilots or tentative methods are being used in the field for decision making, when the implication of those methods, the validity of those methods, the biases inherent to those methods have not been thoroughly explored. So Phuong will talk, because innovation is not just technology. And so I lied when I said it was the last cartoon. There's also this one that says, how can I trust your information when you're using such outdated technology? But it's to emphasize that it's not just about the technology, it's also about the process. And what we're doing now in Venezuela, but also adapting in the context of COVID to several refugee situations, is the use of what is called respondent-driven sampling. And so Phuong will take that over. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's always hard to follow Patrick's, and especially he's done such a great job of describing our research over the decade. What I want to go today, just to go take a step backward and see, kind of get you a sense of how we take challenges in the field and turn it into innovations. And so one example, and I don't have the slides for it, but just, when COVID happens, we immediately launch a COVID perception survey. And it was a global survey. We translated into 21 languages, and we sent it out. And overnight, we had like over 1,000 response. And then the next night, we keep on accumulating. When we looked at the results, we saw that the majority of the respondents were from the US. And of course, because we sent it out from our Harvard emails and tweeted out. But there was another problem. We had translated into 21 languages, and barely the languages link were used. And what we found out was people, use the English. They didn't know how to change. Even in COBOL, it was easy. All you need to do is go on top and click on the languages you need. Before, when we do these one-time surveys and never done a global surveys, it wasn't necessary. You just send out and your survey is already in the language you need. But for this particular one, we had 21 languages and people had to select the languages they want. So we thought, how could we increase responses in other languages? And the only way was to send out links that were specific in that language. So if it's translated in Turkish, it had to be, or Arabic, you send out that link. That wasn't a capability within COBOL. So we worked with our team, and in a few weeks, we were able to release a new version of COBOL that allows you to send out the link like you did, but now whatever your browser language was, it will automatically detect that language and display the survey in that language. So that's one example of how, when we conduct research and we see a challenge in the field, we turn that into an innovations within COBOL. And so now in the 21, you first have to have it. So in any of the 21 languages, anyone who use a browser in Chinese, Vietnamese, or whatever, they will automatically get that link, and it's coronavirussurvey.org. They get the same link, but it will now display in that language. So that's one. And the next one another example I'm going to give you is currently what we're working in. Right now, we are conducting external evaluations of UNHCR response to the Venezuela crisis. And so one of the challenge that we saw when we did the evaluations with the lack of data on the population, especially count data, right? So how many Venezuelan are there? There are estimates, but we know that it's undercounted because there's a lot of irregular crossings and other hidden dynamic. And so this is, so what we did, we proposed to do a survey called respondent-driven sampling. And basically this is based on a method that used in ecology. So today I'm going to present those methods of how do you count hidden and hard to reach population, especially like urban refugees or populations that are hidden. So usually hidden populations, there's no sampling frame, so you don't have a list of Venezuelan who left Venezuela to sample from and then count how many are in Colombia or Peru or Ecuador. And because some of them are crossing some of the border irregularly, they want to remain hidden. And so how do you do that? So there are several methods. There's actually two specific methods to count hidden and hard to reach populations that are commonly used. One is called the capture recaptured, sometimes called mark and recaptured. This is only feasible when you have the ability to either have two sets of databases on the same populations, or you're able to assess this population twice, because what you basically do is, you capture them one time, you mark them, like in birds. How do you count birds? How many birds are there? You captured them first, you mark them, and then you release them, and you capture them again, and then you count that. And the second method is the respondent-driven sampling. It's a derivative of a qualitative non-probability sampling called snowball sampling. So you ask, who, is a migrant from Venezuela. You ask them, and then you ask them if they know any other migrants. So they refer you to another person. So you go down. But this was a derivative where you can take that methods and be able to actually use it and quantify it, and I'll describe more of that in the next couple of slides. So, but beyond countings, these two methods also allow you to understand some of the characteristics of these populations. So again, capture recaptures derive from ecology. I'm used to estimate animals. So a portion of the population is captured, marked, released, and then later another population is captured, and that number of marked individuals within the sample is counted. So basically, to calculate how the estimated populations, you just get the number of marked in the first sample times the total number caught in the second sample, divided by the number of marked in the second samples. And that's a very simple methods, but again, it's a practical matter whether you can actually have it. This is one example done for refugee populations in the US, where they have three databases. One is a database where they have various services to refugees. Another database, which was public school, where a lot of the refugee attend, and then also a third one where they have a health insurance policy for some of the refugees. They took those three and they see where they overlaps, and so they use that capture recapture methods to calculate the estimated number of refugees in this particular population. Sorry. I'll go in more details in this this respondent-driven sampling, because this is the one that we're using in Venezuela next month. It's a sampling and analysis technique used to estimate and understand hard-to-reach population. So it's, as I mentioned, it's an adaptive version of snowball sampling. And basically, in snowball sampling, you just start out with one or two. But in the respondent-driven sampling, you make a very deliberate attempt to identify the seeds, and the number of seed is what varies. And so you would do typically 3 to 10 seed, and then the seed is where you start and say, these are the 10 seed that for example, that are Venezuelan migrants who migrated to Colombia. Or if you want to look at really hard to reach, these are the people who've actually crossed the border irregularly, or these are the people when crossing the border had experienced some sort of gender-based violence. And so you select those seed based on certain characteristics, and then you ask them to recommend, and you go down the referral change, and you do it multiple times. We're engaging this survey in Colombia, and hopefully by the end of your survey, based on the seed, you will have something like this where they will refer a lot. And what you don't want to happen is where you see the small little network where you start out with a seed and it kind of stopped there. So you want your initial seed to be highly networked population that knows a lot. There are three approaches to do respondent-driven sampling. One is an in-person interviews, which was what we had planned to do, where you'd interview people in person, and after you interview them, you ask them if they know anyone else with the characteristics that you outlined. With COVID, we had to look at remote assessments, and so that presented some challenges, but RDS already had some challenges, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes. So we had to go remote. So we're going to do two approach because we like to experiment. So we're going to do a telephone-based interviews where we would interview just as if we were doing in person, and then we're going to try an online versions where we start out the seed online and then have them refer online. It presents a lot of technological challenges to manage this, and especially there's no software that deals with these hyper managements yet. They have chunk, and they, in all these referrals, so how do you know who recommend who? You have to generate all these coupons and stuff like that. So there's a lot of practical implications. So we're using this as an example of to explore how COBOL can assist us in the future. It's not available now, but how do we assist us in the future? So we've, as Patrick said, we use a lot of storyboarding. And in order to really do a good storyboard, you really need to understand all of the details. So this is why this is so great that our team does not only just the technology development, but actually these research itself. So really understanding some of the key details. So in the first data flow, you have this is the phone-based one, where the interviewer call the person, their initial seed, and then they do the interviews, they do the consenting, the interviews, and then at the end they ask for 3 referral. Usually with respondent-driven sampling, to get the response, you have to have incentives. So there's a couple of practical matters in this. One is it like a call centers, you would have to have somebody who manages all these phone numbers, and then be able to see who recommend who. And then as Patrick mentions, there's also privacy issues too, because now everyone's in our database would have, their name and their phone numbers, and then all of these tells about, whether they crossed the border illegally, they have experienced gender-based violence, so very sensitive information. So how do you separate the tool? So what we've done for COBOL was actually have one was an Airtable or an Excel table that manages the phone numbers and the respondent names, all the seeds, and then in that table there's we create a program that automatically create a ID. That ID is then linked to COBOL, and then and then COBOL, it automatically input that ID into COBOL. My concern when we did this was, we've done a lot of surveys where you have people enter unique IDs, and these unique IDs are, complex. So they always, out of 100 surveys, there's always 2 or 3 surveys where they enter the unique ID wrong, and then later on you can't match the 2 piece of information. So what we did was we had our programs that automatically complete that into COBOL. So like when you open the forms and this person is person X that was referred by X, that particular form, so you don't have to enter. That's innovations that we just developed that is available, but the next couple one I'm going to mention are still in the work. So after the persons who complete the surveys, you want to send them incentives. So the incentives could be mobile money, could be phone credits. So how do you send them? How do you know when especially if you do for the phone interviews, you would know after you complete. how do you, but on the online versions, how do you know when that's completed so that you can, so that's where COBOL comes in. So we will have a report, and it was emailed to you, and it says, you know, one is once they complete that surveys, COBOL automatically send the first incentives, or it was alert the invitation managers, and then the incentives are sent. So there's some version, either one is an alert system or an automatic distributions of the incentives to the thing. So that's the for the phone. The second step is once they have received the second, there's two incentives. One is when you complete the survey. The second time is you successfully refer somebody. And again, that same step, whether COBOL automatically send the second incentives or it alert and a manager that sends out that incentive. We're working that out. And then the online versions, there are complications where, for example, where I mentioned, like for the phone interviews, it's really easy for the person who's conducting the interviews to manage that Excel spreadsheets of who refer who. But on the online, how do you get COBOL to recognize every time somebody receive a link that person Y recommend to them? And so that's where if we can get COBOL to generate the invitations, each invitation has a unique code, and once that invitation is sent, COBOL automatically enter and recognizes that unique code and then complete that forms. That's where I think a lot of the innovations will come in the next version of COBOL to make it, you know, enable to do this type of surveying techniques and make it easier for people. Right now it's being done, but a lot of it is manuals, and it's, you know, very subjected to error. And as Patrick mentions, not only are we interested in making timely and quality data, but we want also the data to use COBOL as a way to overcome some of the field challenges that you see as you explore. Patrick is just alerting me that I'm out of time, so I'm going to end there. I have a few more slides, but I'm going to end it there.
Oh, that's unfair. No. No, I'm sorry. We wanted to leave at least some time for there was just one slide, yeah. But we just wanted to leave room for discussion. But just as a general summary, you know, the message or the aspects we wanted to discuss were, one, this, you know, focus on perception as a key to understand how people make decisions, but also the need to make sure that how you measure those perception is very localized and context specific and developed through participatory approach. Then leverage technologies, but also processes to collect this data in the most efficient and reliable manner to then create space for policy and program discussion and inform those decision making, but without necessarily being prescriptive, just embracing the complexity ultimately of those decisions, and just make sure that decisions are informed by the best available data. I think Phuong had a lot to share. I had a lot to share, so I hope we were not too much all over the place, but look forward to the discussion. I think we can probably, I see some hands being raised, and then maybe we can, so I'll try to switch back the screen share, and maybe we can, so we can see there you go.
Thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. And I have to say I personally learned from some of the tools you've presented. I want to add on we got many comments on the fact that COBOL is being used. I know colleagues have myself used COBOL. So yeah, I concur, really useful tool. We already have questions in the chat, so I suggest that we start with a question that were in the in the chat, and if there are hand raised, we could then move on to the hand raised. If that's okay for you, Juan Patrick.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I have to say, I'm sorry sorry, there's an echo. We couldn't see the chat while we were presenting, so I'm sorry if there were questions. We thought we were going to be able to see them and answer as we discussed, but we were not able.
No worries. So I can come back. I can come back to the question that I've seen passing on the chat, and I've written them down. So one question was about how do you get to work in a specific country, specifically for the case of Brazil, for example. How do you end up working on a specific country? Is it demand-driven? Do you have to convince locally? Or do you end up working on one specific country?
Well, Phuong, you want
to? We have always done a lot of countries for comparison, and as Patrick mentions, we do work in a lot of contexts. So currently, right now, we have research in DRC, Central African Republic, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru.
I would say in part it's unfortunately or not, it's a bit donor driven, but for our research we also approach specific foundations. Interestingly, because CAR, the Central African Republic, has become a big part of our work, and it was not planned. It's just because we were able to convince the donor to switch country, and they allowed us to do that, but it wasn't part of the initial proposal. And it's one of those places where there is so little data. I will just make a pitch. One of the interesting aspects, for the first time, we were able to do a cross-border research between Burundi, Rwanda, and DRC, which has its own broad sets of challenges. But there's really a lack of those type of research, and they are challenging because you deal with different governments, different institutions, and so on. But when you talk about refugee situation, it's so critical to be able to work across the border that we really need to improve how we do that.
Thank you so much. As I'm going through the question, please, for those of us who have asked this question in the chat, please feel free to raise your hand and actually add on or ask your question directly. That's very welcome. In terms of this demand-driven versus how much you have to convince, there is also a question at the level of a household or an individual. How do you get to interview a refugee, and how do you deal with potential resistance from the respondent? So you mentioned the incentive mechanism in the specific case that you have presented, but could you come back on this specific aspect?
Yeah, getting response rate, it really depends. Like, for example, when we did the surveys, the 3 waves of surveys in Uganda when the LRA was were actives, and about 99 or 98, depending on which locations of the populations were displaced internally. There, because they were in some of the camps, and some of the questions we asked were engaging, we had a very, very high response rate. And I understand now that, for example, we are looking at some data that does related to COVID, where they did random digit dialing, and the response rate 15% on those. And so it really varies depending on the modality you use and the context. And then getting into how do you get to the individual, I think it's, we a lot of time use a typical EPI, WHO EPI methods, where you first, especially when you don't have sampling frame, you do cluster sampling. So you first choose geographics, and then you go down to the geographics to that household. And then when you get to that household, you list the respondents in your eligibility criteria. So if they're adults, you list all of the adults, and you randomly select one using any methods, either first person with the letter alphabet closest to A, or you know, birthday closest to January, or just pick their name out of a hat. But everything's depending on how precise they are. And even now, I think with satellite, a couple of our friends are taking pictures of those geographic regions and then mapping those out, hand mapping them, and then choosing the household and then going back to that household to choose the individuals that I mentioned. But you want to be as random as possible so that it can be representative. So that's the key.
Thank you. I see questions on specific countries, but that relate to a generic topic on which we would like to get your insight. It's about data accessibility and the publication of data. And if you can come back on first your policy on this, and also on the, not going too deep into detail, but on the technicality, like what you have already accessible, or what can be used by third parts, and being researchers or other researchers or practitioners. How do you deal with data accessibility? Thank you.
For our research, we created a website called peacebuildingdata.org, where we upload all of our data sets in an explorable map and indicators, so they can just go in there. And I think Patrick will send you now the link through the chat box. So we tried, rather than giving raw data out, which has identifying, we strip that up and then load it in a way that is explorable. And then we also have reports. But what we found early on was if we did data collections and we just put it in a report, we will see a lot of the referencings or people using our data are from Western countries. And so what we did was when we did a survey in Liberia, we decided to put this in what we call the global map system, where Patrick is going to share the screen in a second, where we allow people to explore the indicators. And for Liberia, for the first time, we start seeing people using our in country. So inside of Liberia, people were, referencing us, talking about the data and quoting the data. And the reason why was, and this is another technology developments, you will see that there's thousands of maps behind. I don't know if maybe we haven't shared screen yet. Can you see? No. We're going to share the screen right now, but Patrick's going to show you, this is called global map. And it's all of the data, the maps here you'll see is based on an Excel spreadsheet. And this was done about 10 years ago. And you'll see that the files are very light, so you can navigate it fairly easily. It's not as pretty, it's an old system, but you can see the maps. So rather than doing one map at a time, we just upload it all at once, and it automatically maps all the indicators, and you can navigate. And what you see are all the data from the DRC, the quarterly polls that Patrick mentions earlier. So you can navigate and you can see and you explore those indicators. And as I mentioned before, that makes it more user-friendly and interactive, and people can get the data they need when they want to.
I just want to note just very briefly, for protection reasons, we typically do not share openly the raw data, but we do make available full spreadsheets with aggregated data, typically by administrative region, by gender, and often wealth and age disaggregated as well. The countries are listed there. The website does not have everything, but we can easily share a list of all the countries where we work.
Thank you so much. That's very insightful as well for our work at the JDC. Thank you. I have a very specific question on the features you've just presented on Kobo, and whether you have a sense of the timeline when this will be released. It's a very specific question.
We're working on it because we're conducting the survey in July. So first we're going to do the phone-based interview, and I think part of that is trying to understand how you manage the data. So we're hoping with that, it will result in a technology that's available for the respondent-driven sampling. But our other goal is actually so that people can also use it for a COBOL as a call center as well, a way to manage these type of phone-based interviews for remote. And so we're hoping that within a couple of months after the survey has been conducted, that those technologies are available. But we'll, as usual, COBOL is once we have updates, we release them on a rolling basis. So if we can make it sooner, we'll make it sooner. And then the onlines, again, we'll conduct that after the phone-based interview. So we're trying to get it as fast as possible because we know that people are doing a lot of remote data collections. We had expected the number of users for COBOL to decrease during COVID because a lot of people use forms to do in person, but we didn't realize that a lot of people actually were using for COVID and remote assessments. So we saw from 6 million submissions a month to 10 million submissions per month.
Thank you so much. Sorry to go back to this, but the website you presented through a screen sharing, I don't think everyone could see it. If you could share the link in the chat or with us, and we will post it in the document that we share later after the seminar, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sharing the link. Oops, I need to add the website needs a bit of upgrading. Some of the latest research is not up yet, but we're working on that. And in the meantime, you can see a lot of our approach there already.
Thank you so much. There is a question coming from UNHCR, Pedro Mendes, and I wanted to invite you to ask the question directly, Pedro, if you can hear me.
Merci, Arthur. My question relates to the great emphasis on socioeconomic data. As you mentioned, Patrick, it's important to have credible data on livelihoods and service provision. My question is, how much are you able, and actually if there is a purpose, intention to seek for data that also that also speaks to the protection side of forced displacement, which sometimes it's maybe more relevant to decisions of return, for instance. And how do you address the challenge of having quantitative data on that? Thank you.
Just among displaced population, but in most of the conflicts where we work, displacement is probably the most common feature, and you've got large amount of people that have been displaced. So while we don't always frame all of the research around displacement, it's always a very important component. When it comes to service, livelihood, and so on, they are important. I want to emphasize that a lot of what we do is around perception. So we ask people how they perceive their access to water, for example, as opposed to objective measures of access. So we don't measure distance to school. We don't have those objective indicators. We largely focus on perception. And so on your last question, the one of perception is the same each. In instance, questions that touch more on perception, but one of those questions are typically defined very locally, and they are typically also based on, again, perception and what people report. I'll give a very different example, but just because that's what I'm working on at the moment, which is a look at the effectiveness of MONUSCO and peacekeeping mission in the field. And, you know, we focus on the perception of security, not necessarily the reality of the risk or the prevalence of violence or objective measures. We very much look on those perception. And so in the case of displacement, I agree that the perceived risk of associated with protection are extremely important. In Iraq, we didn't frame it necessarily as protection, but they clearly came through in an important manner when we asked people around what barriers they have to return, or what are the preconditions that need to be satisfied before they would consider returning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There are many more questions on the chat, and we will continue going through them. Before I do so, is it okay, Patrick, Phuong, if we send you the remaining question, the unanswered question, because of the time constraint?
Yes.
And okay, that's amazing. Thank you so much. We haven't talked much about COVID during this webinar. We did at some point, and it was refreshing to not spend a long time talking about COVID, but still we wanted to hear your experience on your reaction to the COVID crisis. Many of us here are either supervising or implementing phone survey or sponsoring phone surveys, and because of the constraint on the social distancing, all the animators training, the face-to-face interviews, all of this has been dramatically affected. We wanted to hear about your experience there. Is it that you have to postpone some of the activities or most of the activities? Is it that you have to switch gear and actually completely change the way you work? And I think it would be very interesting for us and for the audience to learn about this experience of yours. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've done 3 things. I think there are some, like for the Venezuela I mentioned earlier, we adapted our methodology from an in-person interviews to do the phone-based interviews. However, we looked at data on phone, these random digit dialing, and one of our biggest fear with that is that we were afraid that people hang up, like especially if somebody calls you out of the blue. And so we then decided, well, why don't we also try online survey and send out the link? But then that means that, you know, we assume that this either migrant or refugees have internet access as well. So there's limitations with that. So both methods are not satisfactory, doesn't cover everyone. So we decided, okay, well, why don't we do both? We're in the luxury where and so that's what we're on this journey right now in Colombia, is to conduct both, and we'll see what's the limitations of that. We've also worked with other teams to look at some of the limitations and also some of the possibility with these. So we have looked at and compare doing IVR where people call people and have these touch voice interviews. They're limited. You can ask about 10, 15 questions maximum. The data is pretty good, but it's very general questions. And then we also compare that to some, all these the random digit dialings too, and we're looking at that. So we're just looking at and helping people looking at what are the feasibility of it, what are the limitations, and what you can use it for. But I think, lack of everything else, we are that they are feasible. And then if you can, I think one of the other challenge that a lot of our partners are facing is the ethical challenge, is where in a countries people are not under lockdown, they're not social distancing, and so so can you still send surveyor out? And there's 2 risks involved. One is the risk that the interviewer that you sent out might get infected, or the interviewee get infected, the spreading of COVID. And so there are ethical. So I think we've been working with some of our partners to kind of go through that, but there are some challenges with that as well.
If I can, I know we are short on time and there are many questions, but I do want to make three points. The first one is that we've actually done extensive data collection during the Ebola outbreak And we've always been able to work under very difficult circumstances in the rebel controlled area and so on. So I don't think we ever imagined this level of disruption. We were in fact in the process of setting up a cold center in Eastern DRC. So I'm very much regret it wasn't finished or it wasn't ready on time. But to me, it's really, so the first one is this is really a fundamental call to do better, to be ready for that kind of disruption, because we were not, and that's what we do all the time. So for organizations that don't do this all the time, I can understand the disruption. The second point is that in the drive to still try to do something, we have to be careful. I'm not going to name or shame, but I was just looking at an assessment that has been done in Goma on COVID-19 using remote phone base, and the people they are interviewed were 75% of them are men, 80% have a university level degree, and they are in the very wealthy part, because we have good demographics for Goma we can compare. It's to the point where you cannot correct the bias in the sample. So I think we have to be very cautious, and I would rather not have data than having data that misrepresents the situation. And so I think, again, while we all want to get feedback, we all need to have information, we need to be very cautious. And the third one, and that's really what Phuong has been doing with the RDS, is there are ways of doing it. There are ways of doing it well, but we need to do it carefully and approach this, even if it means delaying some data collection. And so we've worked on a number of initiatives. Again, there's value in non-representative samples, but it's about understanding the limitations of them and taking every step possible to correct those biases when possible. And then I lied when I said I had 3 points, because I have a fourth one, which is less on the methods and more on the substantive part, because what Ebola has taught us is the importance of trust, the importance of the relations that exist between humanitarians and communities, the importance of understanding the expectation and how we as external actors are being perceived. And one of the challenges of COVID is we, the international community largely, but even local NGOs, are able to continue to operate. We're able to isolate. We're able to leave the country if need be, whereas communities themselves cannot. And so it reinforced kind of that strong, divide that has always existed. But it really challenges us to do better when it comes then to localization and making sure we empower people on the ground. Sorry, it's maybe beside the point, but.
Thank you so much. I think we're reaching the end of this webinar. Really, thank you for a great presentation and an insightful answer to the question we received. You started the presentation, was not the first slide, I think it was the second, with a map of CAR. I will personally reach out because we do have ongoing activity there, specifically on internally displaced population. And that relates to our coming annual research conference, Joint Data Center Annual Research Conference in Bogota. And I wanted to raise attention to the call for papers that has been shared. So to everyone, you see the link in our chat. I take the opportunity to make some publicity. There were many more questions, all very interesting, and so we will copy them and share them with you both via email. Voilà. Bjorn, do you want to close the seminar? Thank you.
Not necessarily. Sure, I can do that. Just to say how much I also appreciated your presentation, and I think it's great that we can do it this way. I think we had some 100 people on the call, and I mean, and the chat function is such an added bonus to these kinds of seminars, because the questions come in to you, but it's also an opportunity for all of us to exchange with each other during the presentation. It always triggers questions, so it serves multiple purposes. We're looking forward to working with you, Phuong and Patrick, not least on supporting you and developing Kobo even further, and all the other aspects of your efforts at HHI. Thank you all for joining us today. Looking forward to seeing you again at our next seminar, which should be in 3 months or so. We still don't have we haven't decided on the topic or presenters, but stay tuned and we will let you know very soon. Wish you all a good end to the day for those of us who are at that stage, or the rest of a good day, and stay safe and wash your hands. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.